Before we begin this moving story, I urge you, subscribe to the channel now, because here you'll always receive inspiring stories filled with emotion and faith. And take the opportunity to tell me in the comments which city you're watching this video from. I'd love to know where this narrative will take you. Now, close your eyes and imagine yourself in the 1980s, in the heart of Texas, where pain and silence shaped a man who was never the same again. On that gray afternoon, the sound of the small church's bells echoed through the valley as Ethan Miller walked slowly behind his wife's coffin. Her horse, adorned with black ribbons, walked alongside, as if mourning the absence of the woman who would never return. The rusty pickup trucks sat idle on the dirt road, their engines off, and only the squeak of Ethan's boots on the damp mud broke the silence. He no longer cried. His tears had dried the night of the accident. Ethan remembered the AM radio blaring in the living room, playing a country dirge when he received the news. His wife had fallen from her horse during a simple ride, something they did together almost every day. It was impossible to accept that a life so full of smiles had been snuffed out in seconds. In that moment, as he held the reins of the grieving animal, he felt like a piece of him had died at the ceremony. No one dared speak loudly. Everyone knew that this strong, broad-armed, stubble-bearded cowboy was completely broken inside. Ethan stood his ground, but every step he took beside a casket sounded like a vow of silence. He no longer wanted to live for life, only to honor the dead. Thus began his mission, as strange as it was somber, to train horses for funerals, giving dignity to the farewells of families who, like him, had lost everything. The ranch, once filled with laughter and the smell of freshly baked bread, had now become a cold, empty space. Ethan spent hours sharpening tools, mending fences, or listening to the landline phone ring unanswered. The constant hiss of the radio became his only companion. Every object in the house seemed charged with her presence: the forgotten cup on the table, the coat hanging behind the door, the perfume that still lingered in the bedroom. It was a living mausoleum, and he didn't have the heart to change a thing. Over time, word spread. Families began seeking him out, asking for his horses to carry coffins in symbolic funerals. Ethan accepted, not for the money, but because it was the only way to make sense of the emptiness that consumed him. With each goodbye, he relived the moment of his wife's burial. The smell of wilted flowers, the sound of muffled prayers, and the glow of pickup truck headlights illuminating the night were memories that never left him alone. Despite his fame, Ethan avoided human contact. He would complete his duties, deliver the horses, and return to the silence of the ranch. He didn't accept invitations, didn't answer calls, didn't reply to letters. The town saw him as a respectable but unreachable man, someone who had chosen to live only for death. His hard, distant gaze drove away even those closest to him. It was as if, in his heart, there was no room for any spark of love or hope. One night, sitting on the porch with a bottle of cheap whiskey, Ethan looked up at the starry Texas sky and made a silent vow. He would never allow himself to love again, never again open the doors of his heart to anyone. The distant rumble of a pickup truck on the highway brought back memories of his wife returning from town, smiling and singing along to the radio. He squeezed his eyes shut, trying to erase the memory, but the pain was relentless. Years began to drag by. From each funeral, he retained fragments of stories, small pieces of others' pain. But instead of healing him, this only reinforced the conviction that love was dangerous, that life always stole what one loved most. The phone remained silent. The horses were his only companion, and the ranch a prison with invisible bars. He convinced himself he was fulfilling an almost sacred role, serving as a guardian of others' pain. And it was precisely in this darkness that fate began to prepare something unexpected. something that would shake all Ethan's certainties, challenging. The oath he made under the stars that lonely night. Because even when a man chooses to live only for death, God can choose to restore him to life in a surprising way. Ethan's silence was about to be interrupted by an impossible request. And that request would change everything. By the 1990s, Ethan's name was already being talked about in every neighboring town. At wakes, everyone knew who he was. The cowboy of the horses of death, respected for his discipline and the silent way he conducted each farewell. He had become almost a living legend, a man who transformed pain into ritual. But behind the reverent looks, there was always an air of mystery, as if no one dared get too close. Ethan lived on the edge between the human and the ghost of himself. It was on a sultry afternoon, when the cicadas were chirping loudly, and the AM radio was announcing a storm forecast, that Clara knocked on his door. She was a frail young woman, with pale skin and deep-set eyes, carrying an air of sadness and courage at the same time. Unlike the others who came asking for horses for funerals, she wanted something unexpected, one last ride before death overtook her. Her soft, firm voice disconcerted Ethan, who immediately felt the weight of a request that defied his own logic. At first, he refused. He said his horses were trained to accompany coffins, not for farewell rides. But Clara insisted, looking directly into his eyes with an intensity that seemed to penetrate every wall he'd erected since his wife's death. "It's not a funeral I want," she said. "It's to feel life coursing through me one last time." The words echoed in his mind like a divine call. For the first time in years, Ethan hesitated in the face of his own darkness. That night, alone on the porch, he faced the decision. The distant sound of pickup trucks on the highway, the lightning streaking across the sky, and the wind swaying the trees seemed like signs that something greater was at stake. Ethan knew that accepting would mean breaking his vow to live only for the dead. But there was something in Clara's gaze that wouldn't leave him alone. It was as if God had placed this young woman in his path to break his silence. The next morning, he was waiting for her at the ranch. Clara arrived in a small, battered car, its paint peeling and the radio blaring oldies. She wore a simple dress, but there was a light in her that time and illness could not extinguish. Ethan saddled one of his gentler horses and helped her mount. When their hands touched for an instant, a shiver ran through them both, as if destiny had manifested itself in that brief contact. The ride began slowly under the faded blue Texas sky. The field stretched as far as the eye could see, and the warm wind ruffled Clara's hair. Ethan, riding beside her, silently watched the way her eyes shone. For a moment, he forgot he was standing before someone condemned by medicine. Everything seemed different, as if that moment had stopped time, as if death itself had been forced to wait. Clara closed her eyes and took a deep breath, as if etching the feeling of freedom into her memory. "It's like I'm truly alive," she said, tears streaming down her face. Ethan felt his heart tighten. He had never allowed words like that to touch his chest again. Something in him began to break, and the shadow of loss gave way to a nearly forgotten spark, hope. The cowboy who had buried his soul was now forced to feel again. They rode in silence, with only the sound of hooves echoing across the field and the distant creak of an old gate. At the top of a hill, Clara called a halt. From the horizon, the landscape seemed endless, gilded by the light of the setting sun. She smiled, her eyes brimming with tears, and murmured, "If this is my last day, it's already been worth it." Ethan swallowed, unable to respond. But inside him, a battle raged between the fear of loss and the will to believe. When they returned to the ranch, Clara dismounted with his help. Her eyes met Ethan's, and for a moment they both stood still, breathing the same air, thick with silence and emotion. There was a hidden kiss there, an unspoken desire, but they both knew it wasn't time yet. Clara simply smiled and thanked him, her voice filled with a sweetness that wounded and healed him at the same time. Ethan, motionless, watched as if he had witnessed something impossible. That night, Clara returned home. Everyone expected her body to collapse after the exertion of the trip, but instead, a miracle began to unfold. She didn't get worse, she didn't faint, she didn't develop a fever. On the contrary, she seemed stronger, more alive. The doctors couldn't explain it. And Ethan, alone in his bed, stared at the ceiling with a lump in his throat, trying to understand what had happened. Something bigger than himself was at work, and fate had just opened a door he'd sworn to keep closed forever. It wasn't long before the whole town was buzzing. In grocery stores, on park benches, at gas stations, everyone was talking about the same thing. The woman who should have died within days was walking the streets, her face glowing as if she had cheated death itself. Clara was the subject of every landline call, every conversation drowned out by the blare of AM radios. And amidst all these rumors, one name always surfaced: Ethan Miller, the cowboy of the death horses. Clara, for her part, didn't hide her beliefs. For her, there was no doubt. It was that ride, that horse guided by Ethan, and above all, his presence that had changed everything. God used your hands to give me life again, she told a neighbor, who quickly spread the word throughout town. Soon, Ethan was seen as a man carrying something sacred, even though he himself vehemently denied it. At the ranch, Ethan spent hours sharpening the blade of a hoe, trying to dispel the thoughts that plagued him. He hadn't believed in miracles since the day he buried his wife, but Clara had sparked a doubt within him. What if God was still at work? What if his mission wasn't just to carry death, but to restore hope to those on the brink of death? The idea disturbed him, because it meant opening his heart to something he'd sworn never to touch again. One night, Clara returned to the ranch. She arrived in an old, battered pickup truck and emerged with the same soft smile that had so disconcerted. "Ethan, I need to see you again," she said bluntly. He tried to refuse, saying there was nothing but a tired, pain-scarred man in him. But Clara approached, her eyes shining in the dim porch light. "Then why did God bring me here?" she whispered, leaving him speechless. The meetings began to repeat themselves. Sometimes Clara just wanted to ride in silence. Other times, she wanted to hear Ethan's stories, even though he always told them dryly and briefly. Over time, his rigidity began to dissolve, like an old fence giving way to rust. On one of these rides, Clara held his hand, and for the first time in years, Ethan didn't push her away. A small gesture, but it ignited something in her dormant heart. Meanwhile, the doctors were perplexed. Tests showed that the disease consuming Clara was inexplicably regressing. There was no new medication, no experimental treatment. "It's impossible," they said, leafing through hospital reports, looking at meaningless X-rays. But Clara, serene, said only one thing: "I chose to live. I chose to believe." This faith radiated from her as if it were part of the miracle. Ethan began to feel afraid, not of his feelings for her, but of the weight of the expectations growing. Around him, people began to come to the ranch, asking to see the horses, believing there was something supernatural there. He refused them all, retreating into his solitude. But Clara insisted, "Don't run away, Ethan. Can't you see that God is calling you back to life?" Each word of hers was like a hammer blow to the wall he had built. There were nights when Ethan couldn't sleep. The radio blared songs of love and loss. The bottle of whiskey was half empty, and he found himself remembering Clara's smile, the way she laughed even in the face of death. He wondered if he still had the right to love, if it wouldn't be a betrayal of his wife's memory. But something in him told him this love was different, that it didn't replace the past, but gave new meaning to the future. One evening, Clara approached. Him in the barn. The smell of hay, the sound of horses' hooves, the silence thick with tension. She placed her hand on his face and said, "You don't understand, Ethan. I'm not just alive. I'm being reborn. And it's because of you." He tried to resist, but in that moment, he couldn't. Their lips met in a deep kiss, filled with everything they'd both held back for so long. It was a kiss of surrender, of pain, of faith, and of promise. But even amidst the blossoming love, suspense lingered. At the hospital, new tests confirmed what already seemed impossible. Clara's illness was disappearing. The doctors had no explanation. To them, it was a puzzle that defied science. To Clara, it was the hand of God working through a broken cowboy. And to Ethan, it was a miracle he didn't know whether to embrace or fear. The world seemed to be moving again, and the next step could change everything. Time passed, and it was already the early 2000s when Clara reappeared in the town with the strength of someone who had conquered death. Her recovery seemed impossible, but she walked the streets with firm steps, smiled at the Sunday markets, and even helped out at the church fairs. Everyone commented, "She should be dead, but now she seems more alive than ever." And by her side, there was almost always the silent figure of Ethan Miller, the cowboy who carried a dark past, but now sparked hope wherever he went. Ethan's ranch, once seen as a place of mourning, was beginning to attract different eyes. Was no longer just the home of the horses of death. Some swore his animals carried something divine. Families would go to the wooden gate just to peer out at the fields, hoping to sense a glimpse of the faith that seemed to well up there. Ethan, however, maintained his rigid routine, mending fences, feeding horses, adjusting harnesses. But Clara knew that, behind that silence, a heart was at war with itself. He still blamed himself for every laugh he shared with her, for every look they shared under the sunset. The image of his dead wife haunted him like a shadow, reminding him of his promise to never love again. Many nights, Ethan would turn off the landline and spend hours staring at the old photo on the mantelpiece, wondering if he would betray his memory by allowing himself to live again. But then he would remember Clara's smile and the sense of peace she brought, and his certainty would shatter. Clara, on the other hand, wasn't afraid to show her feelings. She laughed loudly in the back of his truck, sang off-key along to the AM radio, and asked questions he avoided answering. In one such moment, leaning against the ranch fence, she said, "Ethan, love doesn't replace. It renews." He looked away, trying to hide the lump in his throat, but Clara reached out, took his calloused hand, and added, "God didn't bring you to death. He brought you to me." Those words echoed in his soul like thunder. Still, Ethan maintained his mission. He continued to breed horses for funerals, riding each procession with dignity. But the town began to see him as more than a guardian of grief. They whispered that when Ethan led the horses, it seemed even sadness found solace. Some believed the dead departed in peace because of him. And though he denied this burden of faith, he couldn't shake the feeling that Clara had changed his very essence. One evening, after a long day of work, Clara arrived at the ranch carrying a small box wrapped in blue cloth. Curious, Ethan slowly opened it and found inside an old, weather-worn Bible. The yellowed pages still held the scent of incense from the chapel. "It belonged to my mother," Clara said, her voice breaking. She believed this Bible should only be given to her when her mission on earth was complete. "Now I know I must give it to you." Ethan froze. His hands trembled as he touched the sacred object, as if it were heavier than any saddle or rope he had ever held. He tried to protest, to say he wasn't worthy, that his faith had died years ago. But Clara interrupted with a calm, convicting, "Look, don't you see, Ethan? Your mission isn't over. You weren't made just to bear death. you were chosen to bring life back." Those words pierced his soul like a blade, dismantling his last defenses. The silence of the ranch grew dense, broken only by the sound of the horses snorting in the stable. Ethan stared at the Bible as if staring into a mirror of destiny. And Clara, beside him, seemed to carry a certainty greater than any medical diagnosis. He tried to say something, but his voice faltered. Then she leaned closer, and with discreet tears in her eyes, rested her forehead against his. "Don't be afraid to love again," she whispered. Ethan's heart beat like a drum knot. It was at that moment that he realized how deeply he had surrendered. The kiss came inevitably, ardent and deep, sealing everything they had held back until then. His hands cupped her face, and Clara let herself drift away, as if the whole world had stopped to witness. That moment, it was more than love. It was redemption. It was faith embodied in the skin and the breath of life they shared. When they pulled away, Ethan felt he would never be the same again. But Clara didn't smile as she had before. Her eyes, now teary, revealed a secret she hadn't yet told. "Ethan ... I haven't finished my mission yet." The words fell like a stone on his chest. The Bible in his hands seemed to throb, as if hiding answers he wasn't yet ready to hear. Night fell over the ranch. The crickets sang, and a thick suspense hung in the air. Something bigger was about to be revealed. The romance between Ethan and Clara blossomed in small gestures, almost imperceptible to the world, but intense for both of them. There were simple dinners by lamplight, sunset walks along dusty trails, and loose laughter he hadn't heard since the 1980s, when his wife was still alive. The ranch, once heavy with silence and memories of death, now breathed a lightness, as if every corner echoed with life again. And even without admitting it aloud, Ethan already knew Clara had become the heart he thought lost forever. Still, fear lingered within him. Every smile Clara gave him was accompanied by a shadow of doubt. What if the disease returned? What if, after all this, he had to bury her like he had his wife? This thought haunted him every morning he saw her at her most frail, every unexpected cough, every night she seemed overtired. The landline that rang in the middle of the night, bringing back memories of doctors and old death notices, still echoed like a ghost. Clara, however, didn't let fear overwhelm her. She spoke of faith as if breathing, with calm conviction and a serene gaze. "Ethan, miracles can't be explained. They're lived," she said, holding his hand as they walked side by side through the field. The wind carried the scent of hay and wet earth, and the old radio in her truck played songs that seemed to narrate exactly what they were experiencing. For Clara, each day with him was proof that God still wrote unexpected chapters. Ethan tried to believe, but the guilt of his loss still suffocated him. Sometimes he would wake in the middle of the night and sit for hours on the porch, staring up at the starry sky, trying to convince himself that he had the right to love again. He remembered his wife's last words, remembered the silent promise made at her funeral, and wondered if he would betray her memory by surrendering to this new love. But one look at Clara and everything inside him went haywire. Afternoons at the ranch became sacred refuges. She cooked small meals, and they laughed over banal stories as if they were treasures. One of those days, Clara asked to ride again. Ethan was reluctant, but he couldn't resist the gleam of hope in her eyes. They rode side by side, the sun dipping below the horizon and tinging the sky with golden hues. Each step of the horse seemed to seal the promise of a future he wasn't sure he could dream of. At the top of the hill, Clara reined in and stopped. She was silent for a few seconds, taking a deep breath as if thanking God for being there. "You know, Ethan, I never thought I'd still be living this life," she confessed, her voice breaking. He stared at her, his heart pounding in his chest. He wanted to say something, but he kept his mouth shut. And then she smiled, a smile so full of life it nearly brought tears to his eyes. It was impossible to resist that power. Ethan approached slowly, gently cupping her face. "Clara, I don't know what's going to happen. But I know you've changed everything about me." She closed her eyes, and their lips met in a kiss so intense, as if it were the only one that would ever exist. It was a kiss of surrender, of faith, of love that defied death. When they parted, Clara rested her head against his chest, listening to the strong beating of the heart that had been trapped for so long. For a moment, it seemed like nothing could break that moment. The wind blew gently, the horses breathed calmly, and the world finally seemed at peace. Ethan held her tightly, as if to protect her from fate, as if to steal the years the illness had tried to take. He believed, even if only for a few seconds, that the miracle was permanent, that perhaps God had decided to give them a lifetime together. But then, amid the silence, Clara lost her balance. Her eyes rolled back, and her body, once light and full of energy, collapsed in his arms. "Ethan!" cried out her name in despair, his heart pounding like never before. The horses scrambled, the wind seemed to pick up, and the sunset, so beautiful just moments ago, now seemed somber. Everything around them turned to dread at the top of that hill. Ethan held Clara to his chest, begging her to breathe. The fear that had consumed him had become reality. Was the miracle over? Had death returned to collect for daring to love again? Tears fell silently, and the scene ended suspended in meter, as if even time had stopped to await the answer. The drive to the hospital seemed endless. Ethan's truck roared down the dirt road, kicking up dust behind it, while Clara lay unconscious beside him. The radio blared a sad song he didn't even notice, because every second was torment. Upon arrival, doctors and nurses rushed to greet her, quickly placing her on a stretcher. Ethan stood at the door, his heart racing, remembering the day he'd lost his wife in the same way. The feeling of déjà vu overwhelmed him. For the next few hours, Ethan paced the cold, white corridors of the hospital. The smell of ether, the distant whirring of machines, and the sound of hurried footsteps left him entranced. He spoke to no one. He simply stared at the doors, waiting for news. Every time a doctor passed, he feared the worst. It was as if he were trapped in a recurring nightmare, where life kept stealing the very thing he loved most. When a nurse finally brought him information, the words were like knives. "She's in critical condition. We don't know if she make it." Ethan felt the ground disappear beneath his feet. He walked out into the parking lot, leaned against his truck, and for the first time in decades, let the tears fall. The strong, silent cowboy was crumbling there, under the cold lights of the parking lot. The weight of past loss mixed with present fear, and he didn't know how to bear it. In that despair, something unexpected happened. Ethan, the man who had sworn never to speak to God again, fell to his knees and prayed. His calloused hands clasped together, and the words came out brokenly. "Lord, if her life is still in your hands, do not take her from me. If Clara lives, I promise never to run from life again. I promise to love without fear. I promise to be the man she believes I can be." The silence of the night answered only with the distant chirp of a cricket. The next few hours were agonizing. Ethan sat on the hard bench in the waiting room, his hands still shaking, the Bible Clara had given him clutched to his chest. With each door that opened, he stood, but no news came. The payphone in the hallway rang incessantly. The intercom's hiss echoed, but nothing mattered but a single question. Would Clara survive? Time seemed to mock him, passing too slowly, as if testing his faith. Inside the room, Clara struggled between life and death. The doctors spoke of collapse, of impossibility, of statistics that gave her no chance. But amidst that aseptic environment, something invisible seemed to be at work. Her body, still fragile, wouldn't fully surrender. There was a flame that insisted on burning, as if her soul refused to let go. Clara wasn't ready to leave, because she knew her mission wasn't over. Meanwhile, Ethan remembered every smile, every word she'd said about faith and hope. He remembered her saying that love doesn't replace, it renews. He remembered the kissing, the field, and the way she seemed to carry within her a light he'd never known. And for the first time, Ethan felt that perhaps there was indeed a greater purpose to everything they were experiencing. Perhaps somehow Clara was the miracle. God had chosen to bring him back to life. In the silence of the early morning, a doctor finally approached him. His gaze was grave, but not definitive. She's fighting. It's an inexplicable case, but there's still a flame. Ethan took a deep breath, feeling a thread of hope ignite within him. He returned to the hospital balcony, looked up at the starry sky and whispered, "Thank you, God. Don't let me weaken now." This was a man reborn in his faith. After years of exile in the desert of pain, when they let him into the room, Ethan walked slowly to the bed. The sound of the machines monitoring Clara's heart sounded like a sacred hymn. He held her hand tightly, tears falling onto her cold skin. "Clara, I'm here. I'm not leaving. Not ever again." His heartbeat was so strong, it seemed to echo through the room, as if calling her soul back. For a moment, he thought he wouldn't be heard. But then, amidst the silence, Clara's lips moved. With a thin voice, she opened her eyes and called out. A single name, Ethan. His heart raced, and the room seemed to light up. It was as if life had decided to sigh, at least for one more day. The miracle, once again, was present, and fate was far from finished. The sunshine of the 2010s brought a new glow to Ethan's ranch. After months of slow recovery, Clara made the decision that would forever change their fate. She would leave her old home in the city and move closer to him. The move was simple. With just a few boxes and a small car loaded with memories and hope, Ethan welcomed her with a mixture of joy and fear. But deep down he knew this was the fresh start he'd never dared ask God for. The ranch, which for decades had been a symbol of death, now breathed life. Clara planted flowers in the garden, organized the kitchen, and transformed the days of silence into laughter, echoing through the hallways. Together, they began rebuilding the space, not only for funerals, but also as a haven of healing. People facing illness, grief, or invisible pain came seeking comfort, and found their horses that seemed to carry more than strength. They carried peace. Ethan, who had previously seen horses as instruments of farewell, now trained them for something new. Sick children could ride. Grieving families could stroll through the fields and find solace. Every visit was a chance to see life differently. And by his side, Clara was the soul of the place. She welcomed each person with gentle words, always reminding them that love and faith are forces greater than any diagnosis. Sometimes at night, they would sit on the porch, listening to the radio play oldies as the wind blew across the plain. At these times, Ethan allowed himself to truly smile, something he hadn't done since the 1980s. Clara would rest her head on his shoulder, and he felt that, despite all the suffering, he had finally found home. But the shadow of fear still lingered in his heart, reminding him that nothing was guaranteed. The love between them grew quietly and steadily. Sunset walks, hands entwined, and deep conversations under the stars became routine. Ethan, once hardened, now ventured declarations of love. "You're my second chance, Clara," he confessed hoarsely. She smiled, her eyes brimming with tears, and replied, "I'm not just your second chance, Ethan. I'm proof that God never gave up on you." These words always left him speechless, because he knew they were true. But along with love came responsibilities. The ranch, now welcoming visitors from several cities, required constant work. Ethan mended fences, cared for families, and trained horses, while Clara organized prayer meetings and community breakfasts. The landline rang nonstop, and letters arrived from people hearing about the ranch of life. Little by little, the place became a sanctuary without them having planned it. Still, there were nights when Clara would sit in silence, staring into the distance with distant eyes. Ethan noticed, but didn't press. He knew there was something inside her that still tormented her. One such night, sitting side by side in the truck parked in the barn, she whispered, "I'm still scared, Ethan. The illness could come back at any moment." His heart sank, but he held her hand firmly. "If you come back, I'll be with you every second," she replied, her voice thick with emotion. Clara smiled sadly, as if already aware of the gravity of what she was carrying inside her. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of the truck's engine still running, illuminating the field with its headlights. It was a simple scene, yet charged with intensity, as if the entire world were suspended between life and death. The kiss that followed was unlike any other. It wasn't just passion, it was a silent pact. His hands wrapped tightly around her, as if he could protect her even from fate itself. Clara wept softly during the kiss, and Ethan felt the tears wet his face. It was a love too deep to explain, a love that blended fear, faith, and hope in every gesture dot. And then, her voice breaking, Clara confessed, "I could die at any moment, Ethan, but I don't want to waste even a second away from you." Those words fell like thunder in his heart, leaving him breathless. The ranch, lit only by the moon and the ancient lanterns, seemed to bear witness to their pact. Fate was still, written in lines of mystery, and they knew the next chapter could change everything forever. Ethan's ranch, once marked by mourning and silence, was now known throughout the region as a place of rebirth. People no longer called him just the cowboy of the death horses, but the guardian of life. Entire families traveled in vintage pickup trucks and modern cars to experience this place where pain seemed to transform into hope. The repaired fences gleamed in the sun, and the countryside exuded life in every detail, as if even the earth had been healed. The horses, which had once accompanied caskets at funerals, now carried smiling children, widowers seeking comfort, and the sick who longed to feel the country breeze before facing their fears. Stories began to spread. A depressed woman found peace after riding at dusk. A grieving young man regained faith in life after riding one of Ethan's horses. The ranch had become more than a home. It was a sanctuary for the soul. Ethan watched, it all with a mixture of awe and humility. The pain that had crushed him for years had transformed into purpose. He who had sworn to live only for death now saw his life gain meaning through others. The nights he spent praying silently, clutching Clara's Bible, seemed to have shaped his heart for this moment. God didn't leave me buried in the past, he thought. He gave me a future I never expected. Clara was the beating heart of this miracle. She greeted each visitor with a smile, embraced those who cried, and shared her own story as a testament. She would say, "I should be dead, but I'm alive, and I'm alive to love." Her words spread like wildfire, igniting faith in the hearts that came to the ranch. Ethan increasingly realized that her love was as divine as it was human, as eternal as it was urgent. Together, they created unforgettable moments. Community horseback rides at sunset, simple dinners in the lantern-lit barn, prayer meetings under the starry sky. The ranch's landline rang nonstop, bringing new requests from families wanting to visit the place of miracles. Even local newspapers began writing about them, highlighting the transformation of Ethan Miller, the man who had carried death and now offered life. But despite all the light, Clara carried secrets in her eyes. Sometimes, when everyone had left, she would sit alone at the edge of the field, staring into the distance as if waiting for answers. Ethan sensed the weight she was hiding, but he didn't have the courage to ask. He would just approach, place his coat around her shoulders, and embrace her silently, as if his body could protect her even from fate. The love between them blossomed in every gesture, in every stolen kiss in the stable, in every whispered declaration in the middle of the night. "I'm not afraid when I'm with you," Clara would say, resting her head on his chest. Ethan would respond firmly, "And I have no future without you." These words were spoken between tears and laughter, between passion and faith, between the human and the divine. Each night was a battle won against the shadow of death. Then a letter from the hospital arrived, marked with the seal of the neighboring town. Clara was slow to open it, perhaps fearing what she might find. When she finally tore open the envelope, her eyes scanned the lines slowly. The silence in the ranch was so thick that Ethan could only hear the creaking of the wooden beams. Clara took a deep breath, her hands trembling, and an uncertain smile played across her lips. "Ethan, something has changed." Doctors said there had been a definitive transformation in her body. The tests showed no more signs of the disease that had consumed her for years. It was as if the internal scars had disappeared, as if her body had decided to start over from scratch. For science, it was impossible. For Clara, it was confirmation of the miracle. But there was still mystery in her eyes, because she knew that every blessing came with a purpose. Ethan hugged her tightly, his heart bursting with emotion. Tears streamed down her calloused face, and he kissed her forehead repeatedly. "You won, Clara. You won." But inside her, a silent voice told her the story wasn't over yet. The miracle was just the beginning of something much greater, something that would change not only their lives, but the lives of everyone who crossed the ranch gate. Fate still held a revelation no one could have imagined. The early 2020s brought news that seemed definitive. Clara had gone into remission. Perplexed doctors described the case as a miracle with no scientific explanation. Reports and tests confirmed what was already evident. There was no longer any trace of the disease that had condemned her. The entire town celebrated silently, knowing it wasn't just about medicine, but something much greater. The ranch, which had once carried the shadow of death, was now seen as a land of miracles. With their health restored, Clara and Ethan decided to formalize what they already held dear in their hearts. The wedding took place on the ranch itself, with few witnesses, horses roaming the fields, and the sunset dyeing the sky in gold and crimson hues. There was no luxury, only truth. Clara wore a simple lace dress, and Ethan, with a worn hat and trimmed beard, seemed reborn as he said, "Do." As they kissed, the breeze blew through the hills, and many swore they felt the divine presence blessing their union. Their life together became a living testament. The ranch continued to welcome grieving families, but now it was also visited by people seeking renewal, widowers wanting to start over, lost young people searching for purpose, mothers desperate for answers. All found shelter. Ethan trained the horses patiently, and Clara introduced them to visitors as if each animal were a messenger from God. Together, they demonstrated that love and faith could heal even invisible wounds. Time seemed to finally have become an ally. Ethan, who for years had carried the guilt of the loss, now smiled freely. The sound of the old radio still echoed through the ranch, but instead of laments, they were songs of hope. Clara organized prayer meetings by the fire, and the landline rang nonstop with requests for visits. Each day was a new chance to bear witness, and each night a celebration of the love that conquered death. Still, in quiet moments, Ethan wondered how it had all been possible. Had God truly chosen this ranch to become a sanctuary? Or was there something more, something hidden that they didn't yet understand? These questions intensified when anonymous letters began arriving. written on yellowed paper, saying simply, "I know the true secret of this place." At first, they thought it was just superstition or someone playing on the ranch's reputation. But the letters continued, always discreet, always mysterious, as if the sender knew something they didn't. Clara, though worried, insisted on believing it was all divine providence. "The miracle doesn't need to be explained," she would say, with the same conviction that had saved her years before. Ethan, however, felt a restlessness he couldn't control. It was on a quiet afternoon, as the sun was already setting behind the mountains, that the unexpected happened. A black pickup truck with tinted windows and a loud engine slowly pulled through the ranch gate. Ethan frowned and pressed his hat against his forehead, feeling the instinct of alertness take over his body. Clara, beside him, held his hand tightly, as if knowing something important was about to happen. The vehicle stopped in front of the porch. A man got out slowly, tall, weather-beaten, with a serious expression that betrayed heavy stories. He walked toward them with firm steps and remained silent for a few seconds, simply observing the couple. The air seemed heavier, as if fate had paused to listen to his next words. "You think you know what this ranch means," the man said, his deep voice echoing in the silence. "But I know the real secret, and I need to tell you before it's too late." Ethan felt his heart race, and Clara, though firm, felt tears well up in her eyes. The ranch, which until then had been synonymous with peace, was now about to reveal a truth that could change everything. The wind blew hard. The horses neighed uneasily, and the mysterious visitor stood before them, as if carrying a revelation. Held for decades. Ethan's heart pounded like a drum, and Clara clutched the Bible to her chest. Life and eternity seemed to blend in that moment, and the answer that would come could redefine everyone's destiny. A heavy silence fell over the ranch when the mysterious visitor finally revealed his identity. He was the brother of Ethan's deceased wife, a man who carried the old pain of loss in his eyes. For years, he had believed the cowboy had forgotten her memory, replacing it with a new life with Clara. "You promised you'd never love another," he said, his voice breaking. "And yet here you are, rebuilding everything as if she never existed." The accusation fell like a knife to Ethan's chest. But Ethan, firm, took a deep breath and stepped forward. "I never forgot," he said, his deep voice trembling with emotion. "Her memory still lives on in every fence I mended, in every horse I ellied, in every tear I shed in the silence of the night. But God showed me that life isn't just about memories. It's about chances, and He gave me a second chance." The words echoed through the ranch, as if they were meant not just for the visitor, but for all who carry invisible guilt. Clara, standing beside him, clutched the Bible tightly, tears streaming down her face. The visitor remained silent, sensing the sincerity in Ethan's gaze. The wind blew stronger, stirring dust across the field, as if nature itself were witnessing this reckoning. After a few moments, the man bowed his head, murmured a prayer, and said goodbye, leaving behind not the accusation but peace. The ranch, once again, had become a stage for redemption. Over time, Ethan and Clara's story spread beyond Texas borders. The ranch began receiving visits from journalists, pilgrims, and families from across the country. It earned the name Sanctuary of Life, a symbol of faith, healing, and love. Ethan, once the cowboy of death, was now known as the man who learned to love again. Clara, by his side, had become the voice of miracle, reminding everyone that hope knows no bounds. The years passed, and life was generous to them. The ranch prospered, but never lost its simplicity. Afternoons were filled with the laughter of children and grandchildren running among the horses. Clara organized prayer meetings in the lantern-lit barn, and Ethan, his hair already silver, trained the little ones to ride, passing on the legacy of faith and courage that had shaped his own story. On a golden sunset, Clara and Ethan, now elderly, sat side by side on the porch, watching their grandchildren ride in the gentle breeze. He held her hand tenderly, and their eyes met as they had on their first ride so many years ago. It was no longer any fear, only gratitude. That ranch, once a prison of pain, was now home to entire generations. And in every child's laugh, Ethan felt the breath of God reminding him of the miracle of life. He rose slowly, leaning on his cane, and walked to the field. He watched his grandchildren laugh as they mounted horses that carried not only bodies, but also dreams. Silent tears streamed down his wrinkled face, and he understood, finally, that he had never trained animals for death. He had always trained them for life. Horses, from the beginning, were the bridge between pain and hope, between yesterday and tomorrow. Clara approached, leaning on his arm, and together they gazed at the horizon, tinged red by the sunset. The silence was no longer one of mourning, but of plenitude. Ethan kissed her forehead tenderly and murmured, "I loved you in fear. I loved you in miracles, and I will love you until eternity." She smiled, squeezing his hand, and replied, "That was always God's purpose." The ranch breathed life, faith, and love, and their story had become a legacy. Each visitor who arrived took with them a piece of that journey of redemption. Ethan, with a light heart, knew that the miracle hadn't just been saving Clara, but saving him from himself. He had loved again, and that was the greatest gift. And looking one last time at the horses running free across the field, Ethan reflected, silently, sometimes God just waits for you to get back on the horse to show him the journey isn't over. The sentence hung in the wind like a secret whispered to eternity, and the entire ranch seemed to hear it. The cycle was complete, but hope would never end. And so ends the story of Ethan and Clara, a love that conquered death, transformed pain into hope, and showed the world that miracles still happen. The ranch that was born from darkness became a sanctuary of life, faith, and love. And perhaps the greatest lesson is this: no matter how much you've lost, God can always write a new chapter, and often more beautiful than the last dot, if this story touched your heart. Subscribe to the channel now to receive moving and inspiring stories that will warm your soul. Turn on the bell so you don't miss any, because each video here is an encounter with faith, love, and the power of overcoming adversity. I also want you to tell me in the comments, where are you watching this story from? Which part resonated with you the most? Your comment is important because it helps spread even more hope to others who need to hear this message. And remember, stories like this are more than entertainment. They're reminders that life can be difficult, but it never ceases to amaze. Share this video with someone who needs to believe again, because sometimes a simple word can change everything. Thank you for following along this far. May God bless you and your family, and may you never forget, sometimes all He waits for is for you to get back on your feet, to show that the journey isn't over yet.